college, I had the opportunity to study abroad in Argentina for a semester. And when I got to Argentina, I flew into a city that was about 12 hours by bus away from the place where I was going to be staying. So after my international flight overnight, I then hopped on a bus and rode across the country for 12 hours. I was exhausted. My Spanish was conversational at best at this point, and they were playing movies on the bus. And for some reason, the first movie that they chose to play was The Bourne Ultimatum. Now this is the third in a trilogy of movies. The screen was tiny, the movie was obviously in Spanish, and all I wanted to do was go to sleep. But instead, I was trapped there, watching and listening to this movie for which I had no context. I'd never seen any of the Bourne movies, so I had no idea what was happening, who the characters were, what was going on. I just wanted to sleep, and it didn't give me a very good taste of those movies. About 3 years later, Wes and I watched the Bourne trilogy together, and we started with the first movie, and then the second movie, and then finally we got to the Bourne Ultimatum, and I was so excited to find out what that movie was like in a language that I understood, having had the context of the previous movies. I knew who the characters were. I knew what the plot line had been up until that point, and although there's always parts in movies where you get confused, I at least kind of knew what was going on for that whole movie that time. We do something similar with our scripture to what that bus ride and watching the Bourne Ultimatum did for me with that movie. We frequently pull scriptures out of context and plop them down by themselves. And it's like watching a movie in a foreign language when you're exhausted and you have no context for where it's coming from. We do this every single week with our scriptures on Sunday morning because we can't sit down and read a whole chapter of the Bible. Sometimes it works well. Sometimes we get a good chunk of a story and we know enough about that book that we understand where things are going. And sometimes it just leaves us confused, frustrated, and wishing we could take a nap. This week, that happens with our text from Romans. We've been reading through the book of Romans a little bit during the past few weeks, but today we jump into it at the end of the 8th chapter. Paul has been developing a theological argument for the people who would read this letter for 8 chapters, and we jump in at the point where he's reaching a climax in his argument. We jump in with very little context to what he's saying. And what's worse than reading this chunk by itself, which actually is somewhat self-explanatory, is when we pull out verses from this piece of scripture. And this particular one, this happens a lot. You may have recognized a lot of familiar verses as Becky was reading it. One of the ones that people like to pull out of this scripture is where Paul says, "We know that all things work together for the good of those who love God, for those who are called." People use this verse all by itself to explain away all sorts of things. It's become a verse that's kind of akin to those platitudes like, "Everything happens for a reason," or "God has a plan," or "There's always a silver lining to every cloud." People pull it out and use it as if it's supposed to make us feel better about what's going on in our lives. Well, you know God works all things together for good, so your suffering, your pain, it'll be fine. God's at work in this. Just get over it and recognize that God has a bigger plan. Out of context, this verse is unhelpful at best and painful at worst for those who hear it. In context, it's about far more than our day-to-day lives. It actually is not attempting to erase our suffering and pain or the problems of this world. It's not about those things at all. in context, we can see that what Paul is talking about is something eternal, not something temporal. For you see, Paul goes on after he says, all things work together for good, and he explains what he means by that. He says, for God foreknew us. God knew us before we were born. God created us in God's image. God knew what we would be like and what we would do before anyone else even knew we would exist. Then he goes on and says, and God predestined us, those who God foreknew. Now, usually when we hear the term predestined, it hits a switch, right? Some people go to heaven, some people go to hell, and God decided it, and you have no choice in the matter. But that's not at all what Paul means when he says predestined. Paul says that God predestined those he foreknew to be conformed to Christ's image. So first, God creates us in God's image. God knows us before we are even born, and then God leads us to be conformed, to be like Christ. Christ, the one who feeds the hungry, who heals the sick. Christ, the one who tells us about the kingdom. Christ, the one who dies for the sake of the whole world. We are conformed to that image, Paul says. Then he says, 3 more things happen. Then God calls us. Those who God foreknew and predestined are now called. Called, I assume, to be like Christ. Called to go out into the world and proclaim good news. Called to be those who bring light to the world. Then, those who are called are justified. Justified meaning made righteous. Not because of anything that we do, not because of our own worthiness, but because God says, I am making you so. You are righteous in my eyes. And that is all that matters. And as if all that other stuff wasn't enough, then Paul says, we are glorified. God, the maker of all things, the mighty one, the one whom we worship, turns around and glorifies us. Those created in God's image, conformed to Christ, called and justified, we are glorified by God. And this is what Paul is talking about when he says all things work together for good. He's not talking about when all of the stoplights line up just right so you get to work on time. He's not talking about suffering somehow turning into something beautiful. He's not talking about erasing the pain and the reality of life here on earth. He's talking about something much grander. He's not trying to erase the human experience, but to remind us that we are part of something greater than that. That even in the midst of our suffering and the pain of this life, we are children of God. We have been created in God's image. We've been conformed to Christ. We've been called, justified, and glorified. And while that doesn't change or delete or erase the reality of what's going on in our lives right now, it pulls us back and reminds us that the picture is bigger than what we sometimes see. And as if that weren't enough, Paul goes on. Paul says, can anything separate us from Christ's love? I'm sure we've all had times in our lives where we've thought, this is it. There's no way God can love me anymore after this. I've sinned too much, I've strayed too far, I've turned away, and that's it. There's no way I have more chances. Paul lists some of those things that we might think would separate us from God. Nakedness, homelessness, peril, being in the midst of suffering, even death. And Paul says, none of these things. In fact, nothing at all can separate us from God's love. Nothing that we do, nothing that we neglect to do, nothing that's done to us, nothing that was or is to come, nobody with great power or nobody with little power, nothing ever can separate us from God's love for us. That is God working all things together for our good. Nothing can separate us from God's love. We have been called God's children, and that will not change. We have been created in God's image, conformed to the image of Christ. We have been called, justified, and glorified, and nothing can separate us from God's love. Thanks be to God. Amen.